Started. So we're going to continue on in our foundations study. Last week we finished talking about Jacob and his time in Laban's house, and all the eventfulness that came with that, the consequences that I call the class what goes around comes around, because he himself, as somebody who is deceptive, as somebody who took advantage of other people and their weakness in that way, we see Jacob kind of fall for that weakness, because you think about the two times that Jacob deceived somebody else. So think about when he stole the blessing from Isaac. He was wearing his brother's clothes. Morning. He was wearing his brother's clothes. He was wearing the goat skin to try to disguise who he was, disguise his identity in that way. And if you think about the way Laban tricked Jacob with marrying Leah instead of Rachel, he did probably something kind of similar, right? Not that he dressed her up in goat skin, but that instead he would have dressed her in a way that would have made Jacob think that it was Rachel rather than Leah, right? Well, then think about the other thing that Jacob did to steal from somebody else. He stole he purchased the birthright from his brother, but really, what did he use? What did he use in order to deceive his brother? What did he use to kind of convince Esau to sell the birthright to him? Did he use he used food, right? But did he use kind of the rash nature of Esau, and really did he use his kind of desperation, his desire for more than anything? There's nothing in the world at that moment that Esau desired than that food, right? Well, when you think about Jacob serving 7 years for the hand of Rachel, is there anything that Jacob desired more than Rachel? I wouldn't think so, right? I wouldn't think so, because the text describes it as he worked for these 7 years, and it was but days to him, right? Because he desired Rachel so much. So did Laban also use the desire of Jacob, that one-track mindedness that he had, to trick Jacob into doing something that Jacob wouldn't want to do? I would say yes, right? So you think about the two ways in which Laban kind of used different ways to deceive Jacob was kind of the same ways that Jacob used to get things from both his brother and his father in life. So it's very interesting to see that, as I said last time, what goes around comes around in this way. But continuing on with this class, I want to talk about what happens next, because we saw the consequences of what happened. We see all the children born to Jacob, almost all the children born to Jacob by his two wives, Leah and Rachel, at this point. And we're going to see the consequences of favoritism today as we begin talking about kind of the end of this discussion about Jacob and Leah in Laban's house, and begin to talk about the relationship that the family had. Obviously some well-tilled soil that we have just covered in the VBS, getting to Joseph and his story. But we're going to go into a little different features of it, hopefully, and we can mine some good stuff out. But before we begin that today, I'm going to begin us with a word of prayer. So let's go to God in prayer this morning. Heavenly Father, we thank you, we praise you, we give all the glory and honor to you. For you are God who is worthy of all glory and honor. And you have given us so much, Father, and you've given us your word to be able to study, to be able to know you better, know your will better. Help us not to squander this opportunity. Help us not to squander this time, Father, but instead help us to give ourselves fully to you in this time of study. Help us to look to you. Help us to open our hearts to your word, Father. Help me to faithfully teach your word. And help us to take what we learn from here, to apply it to our lives, to be able to better serve you. We ask all these things in your Son's great and holy name. Amen. And so, I talked about at the beginning of this foundations class the fact that I was only going to really be able to hit the highlights. Because if we got too entrenched in all the details of every story of the Bible, well, we would be going through the entire Bible, and that would take us years, right? Years and years and years. Because really, we are in the 9th class. Have we even left the first book of the Bible yet? No, we have not, right? We are like just over halfway through the first book of the Bible. Now, things are going to kind of speed up a little bit later. I'll get to that whenever we get there. There's just a lot of stuff. We're going to build a foundations class. Truly, I used to have a thing. It's a foundations class. I deleted it, I guess. But if I'm truly going to build a foundations class, the foundation is Genesis, right? And so we're going to have to talk about that. And hopefully, like I said, we'll speed up a little bit. But because I have to hit the highlights, there's some things that are going to be missed. And so I have a little slide here that says in the meantime. And I'm going to do this sometimes with classes because sometimes we're going to kind of have to jump. Because last week we have Jacob. He's living under Laban's roof. Laban tricks him after working 7 years to marry his oldest daughter, Leah, who was soft in the eyes, as we're told. And what did that kind of actually mean? She's not the best looking person, right? That's really what that kind of translates to. It's a very nice way of saying it, but yes.
So my grandfather, who was a preacher, he always said that meant she was cross-eyed.
She was cross-eyed.
Weak in the eyes.
That has been an interpretation that people have had. And I can understand why you could get there.
Yeah.
I understand why you get there, but that could possibly be. But one of the main ways that which I've come to understand it is the fact that it's really a euphemism to say
that
she was not the best looking person. And maybe she was cross-eyed. I don't know. But maybe that's part of the reason why she wasn't very good. But I feel bad for her.
I mean, ultimately, she was the opposite of Rachel. It said whereas.
He
was like this, whereas Rachel was.
Whereas, yes.
So
Rachel.
Opposite?
Yes. In a lot of ways. It seemed like in a lot of ways they were kind of opposites. And again, in this whole story, I feel really bad for Leah. I just do. Yeah. Because she got married to a husband that didn't want her. She is described in not the most flattering of terms throughout her story. And, even though she ends up bearing the most children, and that's a blessing to her, she can hold that close to her heart. Not a great existence to have in this way. And by the way, she ends up being the one who survives the longest out of the two sisters as well. We'll get into that this week. So she's blessed in a lot of ways. But anyway, so he tricks Jacob into marrying Leah. He also marries Rachel, and he signs up to serve for another 7 years. And so he's going to continue living under Laban's roof for 7 more years, working for him. And during that time, he is going to be blessed greatly with children, an abundance of children. Last week we talked about 12 of the children he had. He's supposed to have one more at this point. He has 11 sons at this point and 1 daughter. Don't really talk about the daughter that much, but he's got 11 sons and 1 daughter. Most of those children, by the way, coming from Leah, as we just talked about. Some of them coming from the handmaidens that were given, which is why it was important that they emphasized that topic last week. And to this point, Rachel's had exactly how many children? 1, right? And that is Joseph. It's going to change, but we'll get into that later. So in the meantime, Jacob serves under Laban. And here's the thing. Jacob is part of the blessed line. And because of this, everything he does ends up kind of turning to gold. Everything he touches turns to gold at this point. He is greatly enriched under Laban, and so Laban is also greatly enriched. And so because of that, Laban doesn't want Jacob to go anywhere. Now, you would think Jacob's probably going to want to leave after everything that Laban has kind of done to him, right? But Laban doesn't want Jacob to go because they both profited so much in this way. Well, Jacob was told specifically by God to go back to his family's land, the land where his family comes from. And in doing so, he's going to take some of this wealth that he acquired at this point. But obviously, is Laban going to be very happy about this? No. He's not going to be very happy about this, right? Because not only did he not want Jacob to leave, he definitely didn't want Jacob to leave with a bunch of wealth, right, that he had accumulated while working under Laban. Another thing that I didn't write in here that's also important, when they skedaddled, he's going to obviously take his 2 daughters and all his grandchildren. He's going to take Laban's 2 daughters and the grandchildren that Laban has with him. Jacob's going to, right? He's going to take his wife and his children. Well, as they're leaving, Rachel, always the favorite, steals some stuff on the way out. We are specifically told that Rachel steals from Laban some of the household gods, as they're called. These are idols, right? And this was a very common thing to have in ancient times. You would have the particular gods that you worshipped. And usually they were little statues made out of some sort of precious metal. They would be of a high value. And as they're on the way out, Rachel takes some of these household gods from Laban. Now you could say, hey, Laban, why aren't you worshiping the one true God, right? At this point, I think you could probably argue that he should. Kind of shows where his character is at this point. But this leads into a bigger theme, and I won't get too deeply into this today, but when you think about the Jewish people in their day, especially going back all the way to Abraham going forward into the nation of Israel, we always like to think of things as being so simple. We are monotheistic. We believe in one God. And we know that the Hebrew people were supposed to believe in and serve how many gods? One God, right? Only one God, and that is God. The problem is that everyone else in the entire world served one God or many gods? Many gods, right? And so the Jewish people had always had an issue with this because they were the only ones who served one God. Everyone around them served a bunch of gods. And this is why we see this continual issue with idolatry happen. And you see some roots of it here with Laban and Rachel. Because why did she steal the household idols? Was it because they were wealthy or valuable? Or was it because she kind of felt like, well, if I'm going to leave my home, everything I've ever known, I'm going to take some of the things that are close to me here, including maybe some of the gods that I still worship, even though my husband tells me I shouldn't be worshiping this one God. I'm going to take these household gods with me as a little piece of home. I think that's part of the reason why she does this. Regardless, though, she takes this, and Laban was not only going to chase Jacob because Jacob has taken some of the wealth that he's accumulated and he's leaving, but guess what? She also stole his stuff. She stole the household gods. Now, does he know that she did it? No, she probably assumes that Jacob did it, right? Because Jacob's taken some of the sheep and all the cattle and the things that he has helped to raise up and bring up in his prosperity. And he probably assumes that Jacob also took the household idols as he left. So we're going to see Jacob flee and do this. However, right before Laban's about to catch Jacob, because even though Jacob got a head start, you got to think about Jacob's situation. Jacob is transporting both of his wives, 11 of his children, all the cattle and the sheep and the livestock and all the wealth and the servants that they had. Are they a very mobile unit? Not so much, right? All Laban has to do is get a couple guys from the village and run after them, and he can catch them pretty quickly. So it was inevitable that Laban was going to catch Jacob. However, right before Laban gets to Jacob, God actually warns Laban to not do anything bad to Jacob. He actually says, don't bless or curse Jacob, which is kind of an interesting thing. And so Laban didn't do anything. He eventually departed peacefully. And we have this whole story that's kind of interesting where he approaches Jacob and he's like, hey, Jacob, what's up? And Jacob was like, well, I'm going to take my family and I'm going to get out of here because I want to leave. And he said, well, that's well and good, but you took my household idols. And Laban goes through everybody's stuff to look to see who took his household idols. The last person whose stuff he checks is Rachel's. But Rachel, kind of funny story, she takes the idol that she took, sits on her donkey, horse, whatever she's on, puts it underneath her, and when they're searching all the stuff, they finally get to her person, and they're like, okay, we need to search you. And she says, I can't get up right now because the time of the woman is upon. And so they're like, okay, we don't want to deal with any of that. So you just stay on your horse. And she's able to kind of get away with this. And it's a very strange moment. Again, we talked about this throughout this class. We'll continue to talk about this class. Just because God uses imperfect people does not mean his plan was imperfect. He has a perfect plan, but he's using imperfect people. Because is there anyone who is perfect besides Jesus? Right? No. So go ahead.
It's kind of similar to when Joseph hid the thing in Benjamin's sack, right?
Kind of interesting, right? Maybe he learned that from somewhere. Maybe he learned that from his mother, right? Yes, and that's a different story for different times. We'll get into that later. So, we see this story, and anyway, Laban goes away peacefully. But there's nothing, and it's a shame that they're not here, that Brad's not here today. Because Bradley asked me a question. He says, so Jacob and Esau, they split ways. They ever come back together in the story? Actually, they do. And we can't really get into the story that much, but Jacob, as he's going back to his family's land, he meets back up with his brother, Esau, his brother whom he took the birthright from and the blessing and all these things. The brother who, by the way, remember, was trying to kill him, who said, I will kill Jacob, I will do this. I'm going to kill him. Eventually, many, many years have passed, at least 14 years, we know at this point, probably a little bit more. They come face to face. And Jacob, by the way, throughout this whole story, is an anxious mess. Why? Because his, mountain of a man brother, who is full of hair everywhere and is this great hunter, right, as he's talked about in the text, is trying to kill him, he thinks. And they're going to meet face to face. But the interesting thing is, Esau doesn't do any of that. Esau actually greets Jacob favorably. It's a nice, warm exchange. Esau actually tries to extend some hospitality to Jacob, but I think Jacob is just so afraid of his brother at this point. He's like, no. Let's not worry about that. I'm going to keep moving on my way and keep doing my thing. But Esau's actually quite pleasant at this point. And by the way, and I talked about this last time, so Esau gets his name Esau because it sounds very similar in the Hebrew dialect to Edom, which is the word for red, right? The word for red. And he gets that name because he's covered in red hair, right? But his descendants are going to be called the Edomites, which are going to be people with red hair, which is kind of interesting to have this group of Middle Easterners with red hair. But this is the way they work. And eventually, the Edomites are going to work as servants under the people of Israel later. And this is why you heard the prophecy that was spoken initially, that the older would serve the younger. Because in the entire story of Jacob and Esau, do you actually see Esau serve under Jacob? Not really. That prophecy is not going to get fully fulfilled until later, when the people of Israel are in the promised land and the Edomites are serving under them as servants. And that happens later. We'll get into that later. But that's kind of an in the meantime snapshot of what happens before they get into their family's land and start spending their time there. Now, we're going to talk about this again, about the children that they had. Now, Jacob's going to obviously end up with 13 children, but only 2 of them came from the favorite wife, Rachel. And, I emphasized this last week, and I'll emphasize this again. If anyone should have been sensitive to favoritism, it should have been Jacob. Should have been. Because was Jacob his father's favorite? No, he was his mother's favorite. Esau was his father's favorite. And because of that, they obviously had a fractured relationship, which led to everything that happened in between the brothers. So shouldn't he not have a favorite wife? Yeah. That's a little bit hard, though, because of the situation that he faced. But, again, should he have just dealt with that and have not had a favorite wife? Yes. But definitely when he has sons, should he have had favorite sons? No, he really shouldn't have. However, that's exactly what is going to end up happening. So let's, we're going to open up. We're going to be in Genesis. We're going to be in, let me get here. 17 years. No, we're not going to get into 37. We're going to do the end. Yeah, we're going to do the end of chapter 35. Also, by the way, another story that we did not talk about, and it's a whole thing, and maybe I'll designate a time for this at some point. Jacob also, while he was on the way, also wrestles with God, it seems like. That's a whole story that is separate, because Jacob actually gets renamed at this point. The story is sometimes going to call him Jacob, sometimes going to call him Israel. But he's actually going to get renamed because of this event that happens to him, where he meets this stranger out in the wilderness, and they are wrestling back and forth, and the stranger that he runs into, says, hey, you need to give up in this situation. And Jacob says, no, I'm not going to give up until you bless me. And he says this multiple times until finally the stranger dislocates his hip. And at that point, he can no longer wrestle anymore. But he's trying to hold on as hard as he can. And at this point, the stranger blesses him. And he renames him Israel. And the word Israel means one who wrestles with God. And so at this point, we're left to ask the question, does he wrestle with the actual physical form of God? Was it just an angel of the Lord? We don't necessarily know what the full situation is. The key point, I think, more than anything else, though, is he gets this name he who wrestles with God. And this is going to be his name, but this is also going to be the name that his descendants are going to take with them, right? They're going to be called the people of Israel. And isn't that a weird name for the people of God to be called? They're going to be called he who wrestles with God.
Well, I mean, they're wrestling with him. They're constantly like going against him and going back and going against him.
And that's the reason why it's a prophetic word. It's a weird thing to call them that, but is it true? Do they continue to kind of wrestle with God? Yeah, sometimes they cling to him, sometimes they're not, sometimes they're trying to fight him, sometimes, because throughout the story of Israel, they're constantly battling, I'm going to serve God and only God, I'm going to serve many gods, including God, I'm not going to serve God at all, they do this continuous thing, so the name Israel ends up being very important, but it's kind of a weird name to start with, right?
So you're saying it should be something like those who are devoted to God.
Those who are devoted to God.
But
We would like to have thought that, but God knew what his people would end up becoming. And so that's why they end up getting this name. But anyway, so they have these children. Let's read, if we will, chapter 35. I would like to read, as we normally do, verses 16. Verses 16 through 29, please, if we wouldn't mind. I'll start in verse 16, Anna 17, 18, so on and so forth. We get to the back row, come back around. Are we good? Okay. Verse 16. Then they journeyed from Bethel when they were still some distance from Ephrath. Rachel went into labor, and she had hard labor.
And when her labor was at its hardest, the midwife said to her, "Do not fear, for you have another son."
And so it was, as her soul was departing, for she died, that she called his name Ben-Oni, but his father called him Benjamin.
So Rachel died, and she was buried on the way to Ephrath, that is Bethlehem.
And Jacob set a pillar on her grave, which is the pillar of Rachel's grave to this day.
Israel journeyed on and pitched his tent beyond the tower of Eder.
While Israel lived in that land, Reuben went and lay with his father's
Bilhah,
his father's concubine, and Israel heard of it. Now the sons of Jacob were 12.
Verse 23 of chapter 35 of Genesis.
The sons of Leah, Reuben the firstborn of Jacob, Simeon, Levi, Judah,
Issachar, yeah.
and Zebulun.
The sons of Rachel, Joseph, and Benjamin.
And the sons of
Bilhah.
Rachel made Dan and
Naphtali.
okay.
The sons of Zilpah, Leah's servant, Gad and Asher. These were the sons of Jacob who were born to him in Paddan Aram.
Very good. And Jacob came to his father Isaac at Mamre, or Kirath Arba, that is Hebron, it's a very important city later, where Abraham and Isaac had sojourned.
Now the days of Isaac were 180 years.
So Isaac breathed his last and died, and was gathered to his people, being old and full of days. And his sons Esau and Jacob buried him.
So a couple interesting things. I'm going to talk about Isaac, and then I'm going to talk about Rachel. So Isaac is the father of who? Jacob and Esau, right? He is the father of Jacob and Esau. Remember, the reason why Isaac was planning on blessing Esau was because he thought his time was coming, his drawing near, right? It's kind of interesting. He seems to have lasted for at least 14 more years, right? He lasted for a lot longer than was thought that would have happened. So he kind of continued on in life. And the other thing that's interesting is, of course, we talk about the reuniting of Jacob and Esau and how important that kind of was. When they bury Isaac, they bury him together, right? This is a nice family bonding moment here as they do this together. I mean, kind of bad circumstances, I guess, but, his father lived a very long time. And they bury Isaac together in this place. Now let's talk about the first part of this. Let's talk about Rachel. So, let me see here. Yes. So Rachel's first child is obviously Joseph, and we've covered that before. But the second child is named Benjamin. So if you have your sheets, I believe the first question, let me double check again. Yes, the first question is Rachel first gave birth to Joseph, That's for number 1 for Joseph. And then she died giving birth to Benjamin. Now, Jacob here changes his name to Benjamin. What was Rachel calling him? Right, Ben-Oni, which if you've got a little footnote down there, it's telling you that this is the son of my sorrow, or son of my strength at this point. And this is a lot of times because this is the last child she was going to give birth to at this point. She is the child that she kind of gave her life to. And so that is what she was going to call him. But Jacob says, well, I don't want you to be known as son of my sorrow or son of my strength. I'm going to call you the son of my right hand, which is what Benjamin means. This is the son of my right hand. Now, you talk about, of all the children, it's always funny, of all the children of Jacob, these are probably the 2 names that get used the most, which is kind of funny as well, right? No one calls their son Issachar anymore. I know that's a real shame. But sometimes Reuben gets used. But yes, we have Benjamin, we have Joseph, we have a lot of those. No Gads really anymore. But they kind of get used a lot. And these are the names we kind of choose, which again, I think is funny with who was Jacob's favorites, kind of who's our favorites nowadays too. We also get this little tidbit in this story as well, that Reuben, which by the way, who in the birth order, where in the birth order is Reuben? That's right. He was the firstborn. He was the oldest child.
So this makes him knew him when he was a baby.
Oh, yeah, it's weird. It's weird. Yeah. So we get this little tidbit, and it kind of goes through kind of quickly. But it says in verse 22, while Israel lived in that land, wherever they were, Reuben went and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine, and Israel heard of it. Not great. This family's going to have some questionable moments in it. And you don't have to wait for generations to get there. You don't even have to wait for the story of Joseph to get there. Reuben's going to start this now.
Is Bilhah one of the handmaidens?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, Bilhah is one of the handmaids. Yeah, that just makes it
I
extra
thought he'd taken more.
extra nasty. No. Yeah. Huh?
Wait, did Reuben come from Leah though?
Reuben came from Leah.
Okay.
Yes, Reuben was firstborn of Leah. He did not lay with his own mother. He laid with he's laid with some of his brother's mother. That makes it extra nice. It's all just weird. But we see, we know that Joseph is the favorite because he was born of Rachel. But I also think some of this had to deal with this. Right? Some of the reason why Joseph was also the favorite because he was the firstborn of Rachel, the favorite, but also because the firstborn of Leah, his firstborn son, slept with one of his own concubines, is what it calls it, but the handmaid of his wife. And I believe it was, I don't know if Bilhah was Leah's handmaid or was Rachel's handmaid, I forget. But regardless, I think this starts the progression towards like Reuben kind of getting shunted off to the side at this point.
Who's Rachel's handmaid?
Rachel's handmaid. Okay, that makes it slightly less worse, I guess. It's still
right
terrible.
to me.
Yeah.
They're just following after their great-great-granddaddy.
That's right. Well, yeah, and that's a whole problem. We're going to see a little bit of roots of that as well as we get into the Joseph story and where that leads to as well. But yeah,
Is
it's
this
not.
just God's way of making sure the bloodline stays somewhat?
Well, no, because he didn't bear a child by her. He just laid with her.
Oh.
No, he
So
didn't.
this was for fun.
Well, fun for one, yes. Yeah. This was purely out of sinful desire. Is all this was, right?
Everybody knew about it because it was written down.
Because it's written down, yes. It's clearly written down. Moses decided to take some time out to do this. Yeah, I mean, it's clearly something, and I think it is important because we talk about why is Joseph the favorite? Well, I think part of the reason is because, of course, he's like I said, the firstborn of Rachel, but also I think it's because his firstborn son kind of did a bad thing, obviously here at this point, right? And that probably fed into the fact that Reuben was not going to be the favorite at this point because he did things like this. So a lot of consequences and tentacles to this. It's not great at all. But now, because Joseph was the firstborn son from his favorite wife, he naturally becomes the favorite at this point. We'll get into that later. But I want to talk about this, and we all kind of are familiar with this, but Joseph was hated by his brothers because he was the what? the favorite at this point, right? And that's number 2 on your sheet. He was the favorite. And I want you to think about this family dynamic, if you are one of the brothers of Joseph at this point. Because, we can get quite territorial about our stuff, right? Our things. We can get very prideful about our things, right? You can think about, where you're from. You're allowed to make fun of where you're from, but if somebody else from some other place makes fun of where you're from, is that okay? No, it's not, right? Like, we can make fun of America as much as we want to, but if people in the foreign country make fun of America, that's not okay, right? Or anything else we've got, we hold tight to this way. Think about the dynamic if you are a child of Leah, born first, born to a mother who was never really treated right by your father. Then Joseph comes along. Finally, the child given to him through the favorite wife, the favorite, I guess, mother, and I don't know what the relationship would be. I want you to think about just the first psychological effect that would have on you. The fact that you're my brother, but we're half brothers. And you were born to the mother whom our father really liked. Our mother had to sleep alone most nights. Your mother was sleeping in the tent with Jake.
She's still gonna get pregnant.
And she's still going to get pregnant a lot of times, right? And our mother had to sell her mandrakes in order to buy a night with the father, right? There's a lot of reasons why you would kind of have a chip on your shoulder at this point towards Joseph. And then as life continues on, we see the treatment of Joseph. Does Joseph have to work in the fields like his brothers did? No, right? Does Joseph have to do the manual labor that his brothers do? No, they don't. Who gets the nicest and newest clothing? Oh, it's Joseph. Who gets taken care of and pampered in this way? Well, it's always Joseph. And then one day the next thing happens, and I'm going to read. We'll read this real quick, and then we'll close out for today. If we could read verses, chapter 37, verses 1 through 11, please. And I'll go ahead and start in verse 1 and to verse 2, Cody 3, and so on and so forth. We'll do that again. Starting in verse 1 of chapter 37. Jacob lived in the land of his father's sojournings in the land of Canaan.
These are the generations of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was pasturing the flock with his brothers. He was a boy with the sons of Bilhah and Zephalah and his father's wives. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father.
Now Israel loved Joseph more than any other of his sons, because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a robe of many colors.
When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him.
Now Joseph had a dream, and he told it to his brothers, and they hated him even more.
He said to them, "Hear this dream that I have dreamed.
Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright. And behold, your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf."
His brothers said to him, "Are you indeed to reign over us? Or are you indeed to rule over us?" So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words.
And he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. "Listen," he said, "I had another dream, and this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me."
When he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?"
His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept his saying in mind.
So we see all the things that we've talked about, we just talked about. But then one day Joseph is out in the field with his brothers, and he kind of tattles on them. Makes them love him even more, right? Then his father gives him this coat of many colors, which of course we know, colors and clothing. Would that have been something that was incredibly valuable in that day and age? You know how much effort it took to color clothing in that day and age? A lot. Now you're not talking about one color or two color. You're talking about multiple colors, right? That's what we're told. Coat of many colors. Now, there's some translations that could be different in that way, but regardless, it's a colorful coat. There are colors involved. And that means this is a very valuable article of clothing. And who gets it? Not any of the sons of Leah, not the oldest, but Joseph. So they hated them even more. Continue to compound. Then Joseph has a dream, two dreams, really, in which he is saying that his brothers are going to bow down to him. We cannot say that what Joseph's brothers did was okay, because it wasn't. But was it understandable? If we're thinking about it in a non-Christian way, if I'm talking to a bunch of non-Christians and I told them a story that happened, well, people would be like, I can understand that.
Does it say that Joseph was like boastful? I know he taught it on them, but was he rude to them?
Well, I'll say this because I do think there needs to be a discussion, and I'll say this and then we'll close out. I think that Joseph was a little arrogant.
Oh, arrogant.
And I say this because not only, obviously, is he the favorite? Does he tattle? He's very quick to be like, hey guys, I had this dream, and guess what? You're all bowing down to me. Oh, by the way, hey guys, I had this dream where you were the stars, and you would bow down to me. I think he was a little arrogant.
Because at this point, he probably knows they don't like him. So why?
Oh, yeah.
What business do you have?
Oh yeah, why is he going to rub it in their face?
Yeah.
And he knew he was the favorite too.
Oh yeah. I mean, it was clear to everybody, including himself. I do think Joseph was a bit arrogant at this point.
Doesn't it say he was 17 too?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes. And if you talk about, 17-year-olds, if you've either been a 17-year-old male or been around 17-year-old males, the heads are a little big, right? The heads are a little big at that point, right? Huh? Just a little. Your chests are a little puffed out. I think Joseph was quite arrogant, and I think that what happens to him next really forms his character in a lot of ways. Now, did he have a heart of gold underneath all that? I think he did, because that shows in his story. Because he gets put in some terrible circumstances, and he ends up showing himself to be a very good person. But I think in the story, we can almost look at Joseph as a character who is, near perfect in a lot of ways, and I don't think he started out that way. I think he started out being the arrogant, favorite, spoiled, pampered boy, and he eventually becomes the man of gold that he becomes later. But some circumstances have to move in that way. And we'll talk about that more next week. So let's go ahead and close out with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we are so thankful to you that you have done all the things that you've done throughout history. You have chosen who you have chosen. You've worked through who you have worked, Father, so that way all things could come together in your plan and in your way, and culminating in your Son, culminating in Christ dying for the sins of the world, freeing us from the bondage of sin, and giving us eternal life. Father, help us not to keep this great gift to ourselves, Father. You have worked so hard throughout history to make things happen so that way we could be free from sin and we could be found in you. Help us to tell more and more about this, Father, so that way they can come to know you and they can come to know your plans and they can see your hand throughout the history of the world, but also in their own lives, Father, and see how you have influenced them to come to you. And help us always to look towards you, Father, being grateful for all that you give us, Father, but most importantly, the salvation that's brought to us through Jesus Christ. Pray all these things in your Son's great and holy name. Amen. All right, thank you all for being here today.